Magandang hapon, good afternoon, konnichiwa, judges, panelists, and participants. I'll be discussing my research entitled Sexual Harassment in Public Transportation, a comparative study between urban Japan and the Philippines, with the hope that this will not only help women, but everyone from sexual harassment, as well as the country's behavioral and cultural change in the future. The issue of women's safety in public transportation is not only a gendered issue, because this study will impact how it is tied to larger structures like the country's history, religion, legal system, and social and cultural norms. Women in developing countries have considerably worse transportation challenges than the rest of the world. But regardless, women have different and complicated travel patterns. In the case of Japan and the Philippines, both Asian countries, the former considered developed, the latter as developing. Does this imply that women are better protected in Japan because of its relatively more advanced public transportation system? And if you will look at figures 1 and 2 in the study of Cesato and Sidaris in 2021, it shows that Manila has lesser feeling of always or often safe on the bus and train. Hence, 90% of women in Manila take precautions compared to more than 60% of women in Tokyo. However, in terms of gender parity, Japan ranked 120th, while the Philippines ranked 17. When we talk about public transportation, it is always tied to mobility, which is the ability to move from one place to another. And according to Valentine in 1989, public transportation is a spatial expression of patriarchy. Why? Because the operationalization when women leave the house is different compared to men. Women have to check if all the doors are locked, if everything is turned off. On the way to the bus or train station, women process their safety. It does not stop there, even while waiting, during the trip, and on the way to the destination. But what's surprising is that this fear is also affecting the country's economy and other larger structures that I mentioned a while ago. A 16.5% reduction in labor force due to lack of safe transportation. Yet, 177 economies do not prohibit these crimes. So this comparative study will explore the relationship between women's mobility and countries' cultural and social norms. Second, the gender-targeted public transportation initiatives of different groups and organizations. And third, the experiences and attitudes of Japanese and Filipino women. This qualitative research study will use secondary data to compare their experiences. The 2020 case study of Shibata in Tokyo and Mateo Babiano et al. In Manila will be used. For the scope and limitations, given that the study of sexual harassment may include Matahara and Pawahara, this study will focus on Sekohara or sexual harassment in public transportation. For the theoretical models, this study will be using Butler and Schmidt's model, which is not mutually exclusive. First, the organizational model that analyzes position and social status, men as the dominant sex, even in public spaces. Second, the sociocultural model emphasizes the traditional sex role expectation of men and women, like the 2019 case study of Ballerino and Roberts on Japanese gender expectations and attitudes, where they interviewed young women, and all of them work in a company that prefers women who wear skirts over pants. Third, the attraction model that sees gender-based violence as a natural outcome. For example, Shintoism banned women from climbing sacred mountains like Mount Omine because women are seen as a distraction to priests, which has been called out by the international community. Let's head to their literature review. Japanese do not conform to specific religion and practice more than one, according to the Agency for Cultural Affairs of Japan. While Confucianism is more than an ethical system or philosophy in Japan, the general tenet is that men will remain superior and women are their subordinate. While Buddhism follows the same logic, women must be reborn as a man in order to achieve enlightenment. Shintoism contributed to this by emphasizing pollution and purity. Women are not allowed to enter Shinto shrines if they have recently given birth or during their menstrual period. Compared to the Philippines, which is the Asia's largest Catholic population, Christianity was introduced by Spaniards. So the standard will not only for the Philippines and Japan, but everywhere is Mother Mary. But in the Philippines, it is highlighted most of the time to young women and even in their sermons. Mga babae, magpasakop kayo sa inyong asawa. or wives to submit themselves to their husband. So to compare, Japan is more upfront in dictating women's structural and personal positions, while in the Philippines, Catholic Church always controls women's autonomy in numerous cases presented in the paper. In both countries, religion created an oppressive environment for women. That's why for biblical scholars, sexual harassment functions as a tool to uphold patriarchy. For the family system and gender roles, in Japan, the Iya system during the Tokugawa period is where men determine family matters, and when the father dies, he is succeeded by his son, not his wife. There's a law prohibiting women to be the head and heirs the family's property. Despite the nuclear model today, the traditional system persists. In the Philippines, it is more egalitarian than patriarchal, but to label wives as ilaw ng tahanan or be the light or guidance to their children, while men as labeled as haliga ng tahanan or pillars of the home and are supposed to be breadwinners. In both countries, to teach children to be modest, and which definitely becomes the standard of the society and women's internalization of society's expectation. For the laws, let's start with definition of sexual harassment. The term sexual harassment in Japan did not exist, and it was referred to as sexual unpleasantness because as an isolated country, Japan was selective in adapting Western terms. So the first case of sexual harassment, or the Fukuoka landmark case, the Japanese courts only used tort law. Another case was the Osaka Aquarium case, which is an employee versus two middle managers. This is where the Japanese courts finally provided grounds for sexual harassment. Now there's a law that prevents harassment in the workplace, which was introduced in 2020. As for the Philippines, the first law that addressed sexual harassment was RA 7877. To expand the coverage of this law, we have now the Safe Spaces Act, which was passed into law in 2019 to include gender-based sexual harassment in public spaces and online. So therefore, if we will compare the timeline and legislations of Japan and the Philippines is more reactive while Japan is lagging behind. The key factor to this is the low proportion of female legislators. For example, only 22.5% or 28 out of 124 females won the upper house in 2019. For the feminist movement, there was a literature written way back Meiji era, but it was disorganized. So women in Meiji era like Toshiko, who was imprisoned for her speech, including confining the daughters in Japan, while Hideko, who founded private school for women, who was also imprisoned. So fast forward to 1990s and today, where some feminists have been successful, but there are still hurdles along the way, like victim blaming. Compared to the Philippines, there are many feminist movements alongside civil society organizations and government bodies. So the ability to express themselves is limited in both countries, Japan and the Philippines. Although with the numerous feminist groups that we have in the Philippines and the media and women's support is more accepted in the Philippines. So to answer the relationship between women's mobility and time spent using public transportation, let's go to the first research question. The women's mobility is referred to as mobility of care because women's trip is more frequent but shorter. So this is called trip chain, as seen in the table of Shibata's 2020 study, right? So for example, before going to work, women have to drop off their children to school. Or before returning home, women must do groceries and other chores. So it is called mobility of care and trip chain. So besides the economic cost of this, women are exposed to greater risk. So the peak time for the rush hours for both countries are the same, which is between 7 to 9 a.m. So what's the relationship between labor participation rate and public transportation? Hansen and Hansen study revealed that women who work full-time have considerable changes in their travel patterns with a fewer non-work activities. So it is uncertain whether Filipino women have more are working part-time job, but since there are more part-time employees in Japan, they are vulnerable to sexual harassment when traveling. So what is the nuance of this? Japan's overcrowded trains are representation of the country's booming economy and Japanese work ethic. But in this research, we have to look at the gender component, which is important to consider. First, the trains are congested with salarymen. And second, their work ethic includes staying late and drinking with their colleagues after work, which give them an excuse for committing sexual harassment. So in both countries, they reinforce sexual harassment needs like modest dress properly for you to not experience sexual harassment, and they have become more embedded in both culture. As for the different stakeholders in this study for the second research question, Hirata argues that Japan's docility established the collectivist culture of Japan. And Japan has always had some level of social activism. So Japan has now different initiatives like women-only cars, the digi-police that alarms when there's harassers, anti-grouping stumps that was sold out the hour it was released. So if we're going to take a look at in the Philippines, there are also initiatives like Safety Pin to know the place which place is safe to walk at night, a chat back for sexual harassment concerns, and VOV-free app. So let's go to the third one. In answering sexual harassment, in answering experiences and attitudes of sexual harassment, the 2020 case study in Tokyo and Manila will be compared. So for the experiences, 46% of women in Japan experience sexual violence compared to 20% of men. While in the Philippines, 43% of respondents had experienced sexual harassment, and 51% of the female respondents have been victims of sexual harassment or assault. As per the attitude, the Philippines and Japan have a history of rejecting women's stories, like the cases presented in this slide, with the similar hashtag #MeToo movement, which is hashtag Kuto movement in Japan and hashtag Iha Ako movement in the Philippines. Hence, in Japan, the case of Prime Minister Fukuda prompted more than 80% of the respondents to say that they will not vote for a politician who has been accused of sexual harassment. So to conclude, while both countries showed that traditional norms still persist, the Philippines has more laws protecting women from sexual harassment, while Japan is still in the middle of fully implementing laws against sexual harassment, and it even has flaws. So both Japan and the Philippines have gender-targeted public transportation like the mobile applications, but as considered by Japanese scholars, the history of Japan as an isolated country extend to its groups and organization because Confucianism values, for example, are still present, the principle of wa or harmony. So this is reflected to how most Japanese women were ignored when they talked about their stories and when they began disclosing their stories of sexual harassment, which disrupted wa or harmony. So despite that the Philippines is a developing country, women are not at a disadvantage when compared to Japan. However, in the Philippines, when accessing women's mobility, the flawed public transportation of the Philippines adds not only to the mobility of women, but also to the accessibility. The first recommendation will be public campaigns to highlight the importance of bystanders calling out harassers. So once society realizes that calling out is an immediate to stop the traumatic experience of women, this is where calling out becomes a norm to combat sexual harassment. Second, to combat the nationwide problem, Japan must institutionalize a solution. The Safe Spaces Act, like the Philippines, that includes online and public spaces, should be legislated to make public transportation safer for women. And lastly, including feminist perspective in public transportation planning is what's missing not only in Japan and the Philippines, but worldwide. So women's concerns are overlooked and oversimplified. Sexual harassment in public spaces, especially in public transportation, is an everyday problem. And if people in the government are unaware, then public support will be in vain. Therefore, to hear women's voices, the government must listen first. And so, thank you so much for listening.